Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy is arguably the most brutal novel ever written. It follows the Glanton Gang, killers who were hired by Texan and Mexican officials to hunt Native Americans in 1849. The story is one of slaughter, scalpings, caged imbeciles, and the most terrifyingly evil villain in fiction. But what makes Blood Meridian most terrifying is that it's based on reality, with much of the story copied from the written confession of a killer from the real Glanton Gang, a man named Samuel Chamberlain, whose accounts of the gang's destruction are abominable but also absurd, showing us an American West totally uncensored by socially accepted narratives or watered-down textbooks. These are the true origins of the world's most brutal book, Blood Meridian. In 1974, writer Cormac McCarthy, the novelist behind The Road and No Country for Old Men, was living in a Tennessee barn and bathing in a nearby lake when he had an idea. His next book, Blood Meridian, would be about the bloodthirsty Glanton Gang, a crimson, nightmarish journey across the American West. So, over the next 11 years, McCarthy went on this journey himself, retracing the Glanton Gang's path through Mexico multiple times, and teaching himself 19th century Spanish, geology, flora, and how to make gunpowder out of piss. When all was done, in 1985, the book that would forever change Westerns was published. Its story followed the kid, a 14-year-old who from the very first page has a taste for mindless violence. The kid flees his drunken father and falls in with the gang of John Joel Glanton. Glanton offers the kid $100 for every Native American scalp he procures, and the kid, having no real desire to do anything else, accepts. As part of the gang, the kid sees men set alight until they lay blackened and shriveled like enormous spiders, girls taken as slaves, and after the first significant massacre of the story, gang members hacking at the dying and decapitating those who knelt for mercy. And the Native Americans are equally as brutal, the most stark of their victims being a tree of babies. 8 of them hung and staring eyeless at the naked sky. This baby tree isn't copied from the real-life account of Sam Chamberlain, but at its core, the story is. You see, just like the fictional kid, Sam Chamberlain flees his home in 1844. The 15-year-old gets in many fights, the most bizarre of which occurring after he wins quite an amount of money at a gaming establishment. When it's past midnight, Sam walks home with a man, Brown, who drank freely at his expense and now joins him along a misty river. Brown tries to rob Sam, but Sam bites his nose and then bayonets him. "I plunged with my weapon," Sam writes, which penetrated his neck, pinning him to the ground. "I pulled out the bayonet and was glad to find the villain was alive. I made him give back my money, we repaired damages, and started for Chalmette. We reached camp at daylight, told the story of a row, and were sent to the hospital," in those exact words. Cormac McCarthy then copies this absurd scene in Blood Meridian, when the kid meets a companion, Toadvine, almost the exact same way. Toadvine affronts him, so the kid knife fights Toadvine in the mud, and eventually gets his head smashed by another guy who has a club. When the kid wakes up in the mud, he wakes up next to Toadvine, and because Toadvine is running from a hotel owner who wants to kill him, the kid helps Toadvine burn down the hotel, and whoever's inside it. The only thing the characters in Blood Meridian really have in common is that they're drunk on murder, and it's similar in Chamberlain's account of reality. In his memoir, we first meet Glanton at a poker bar. A fight erupts between a man with a Mexican blanket and a reckless, good-looking ranger. The ranger pulls his trigger, his revolver fails, then, quick as a flash, Glanton springs up and the ranger falls with a sickening thud to the floor, a corpse, his neck cut half through. The Mexican, it turns out, was one of Glanton's men. Glanton then invites anyone else to take up the ranger's cause and challenge him, but none will. It's then another 31 chapters before Glanton shows up again. Chamberlain finds he and his gang resting by a grove of cottonwoods on the bank of a small stream. Chamberlain introduces himself to Glanton, but instead of shaking Sam's hand, Glanton grabs him by the nose, giving it a severe twist. So Sam then punches Glanton in the face, gets tied up by the gang, and Glanton cocks a gun to Sam's head. For 1 full minute, Glanton glares into his eyes. Then, lowering his pistol, shakes Sam's hand and says, "Real grit, stranger, you'll pass." As the account goes on, Glanton only gets more unhinged. He kills his own injured men to avoid dead weight, and cuts his scalps with the right ear on to prevent fraud. But he also has a genuinely sympathetic backstory, which feels like it comes from an epic Mel Gibson revenge movie. As a boy, Glanton joined the settlement of Stephen, Austin, which is now the capital of Texas. He got engaged to a young orphan girl whose parents were killed by the Lipans, and built her a log hut on the bank of the beautiful Guadalupe. Then, one day, while Glanton was at Steve Austin's house, a band of Lipan warriors raided the outskirts of the settlement, killing and scalping the old women and young children, and carrying away the girls, Glanton's fiancée among them. Glanton pursued the Lipans with the frontiermen, but just as they caught them, the girls were tomahawked and scalped, and Glanton, Chamberlain writes, returned a changed man. In all Indian fights, he was the devil incarnate. Or he would be, were it not for the Judge. The Judge, as he's fictionally depicted in Blood Meridian, is one of the most evil characters ever written. He's giant, 7 feet tall with not a hair to his body. He has ears like a fox, never sleeps, weighs 24 stone, says he will never die, is meticulous in geology and botany, and has his way with children. But before he became one of the most disturbing villains in fiction, the Judge was a real man, and Sam Chamberlain describes him in detail. The second in command, he writes, was a man of gigantic size called Judge Holden of Texas. Who or what he was, no one knew, but a cooler-blooded villain never went unhung. He stood 6'6" in his moccasins, had a large fleshy frame, a dull face destitute of hair and expression. His desires was blood and women, and stories were circulated of horrid crimes committed by him when bearing another name. By far the best educated man in northern Mexico. As evidence for this, Chamberlain describes a time when the gang is on the run from Apaches. While escaping, the Judge, just for fun, leads the men into the Great Canyon of the Colorado, knowing full well they'd be obligated to retrace their steps. And here, believing that these are the first white men to discover what is now the Grand Canyon, the Judge stops to give them a lecture on geology. And it's so ahead of its time that none believe him. Holden's lecture was learned, Chamberlain writes, but hardly true. For one statement he made was that millions of years had produced the result around us, which Glanton said was a damned lie. After some intellectual debate, the Apaches catch up, so the Judge finesses an escape. And this is the paradox of the Judge, in fiction and reality. He's centuries ahead, but more depraved than the worst of them. In Chamberlain's account, in a village of Pima Indians, the Judge violently seizes a girl and proceeds to take gross liberties with her person. It takes a dozen cocked rifles to drive the brute from his prey, and afterward, the village is so enraged that it seemed as if the gang, Chamberlain included, would be wiped out. The Judge, however, just starts talking, and makes some explanation to the crowd in Spanish that appeased them. Again, in those exact words. Cormac McCarthy paints a similar scene in Blood Meridian. After a raid, the Judge adopts a strange dark child covered with ash. Toadvine, who we met earlier in the knife fight, spots the Judge sitting with the boy, making it laugh and dandling it on one knee. Toadvine leaves, and when he comes back 10 minutes later, the child is dead and the Judge had scalped it. Toadvine puts the muzzle of his pistol against the great dome of the Judge's head, but the Judge, like always, talks him out of killing him. In both texts, the Judge's talent for survival is baffling. Near the end of Chamberlain's account, the Judge and Glanton commandeer a ferry. They kill the Indians who object and capture the young girls for wives. The depravity escalates, and after another disgusting orgy, Chamberlain is so thoroughly horrified with the hellish deeds of his gang that he leaves with Tobin, a priest, and 2 others. They escape during a Yuma raid that kills Glanton. And the events that follow are bizarre. You see, the Judge also manages to escape, but he's chased by 12 Yumas, and Chamberlain sees this and takes genuine pity on the Judge, so he goes back and wards off the Yumas with his rifle. And then, once free, the Judge expresses his gratitude by stealing Chamberlain's horse. But at 6'6", he's so big that the horse throws him, and the party catches him up. The judge then tries to turn it off as a joke, but the others don't accept, instead tying him up and riding off. But then Sam, being a kind-hearted boy, has a crisis of conscience. The judge is a white man, he writes. I'll be damned if he shall go under in that fashion. So Chamberlain turns back, cuts the judge free, and leaves him to fend for himself. Which, knowing the judge is a genius at surviving, is a bad idea. Sure enough, a few nights later, the judge returns. Sam spots him sitting cross-legged by the fire of their camp, broiling the priest's donkey. But the judge just seems happy chomping, so once and for all, Sam escapes. For the rest of his life, Chamberlain lived peacefully, but the end of his confession is regretful. I'd fancied myself a man, he wrote, when I was nothing but a boy. A boy lucky to escape with his life, unlike the kid, our fictional lead, who loses everything. Decades after the Glanton Gang disbands, the judge finds the kid in a bar. This night thy soul may be required of thee, the judge warns. And it is. The judge violates and kills him in an outhouse toilet, erasing the kid from the earth, and leaving us with a word of caution. A warning first laid by Chamberlain, and now laid by a character so frightening we made a whole sister video on him. Lead your life or risk being led. Will or nil. If you're inspired to read Blood Meridian, you can find it at the link in the description.